18 февраля 1944 года. A basement room in a requisitioned office building, Washington, D.C. Sergeant First Class Dorothy Hamill, 26 years old, originally from Dayton, Ohio, a school teacher before the war, fluent in German from 2 years at Ohio State University, sits at a long wooden table covered in paper. Not in stacks, in piles. Hundreds of them, some still sealed in their original envelopes, some folded and refolded so many times the creases have worn through. The ink on many of them is smeared, some are water-stained. A few smell of something she has learned not to identify. She is not reading them for pleasure. She works for the Postal Censorship Division of the Office of Censorship, one of roughly 14,000 American civilians who, at the war's peak, processed an estimated 250,000 pieces of enemy mail every single week. Her job is not to find military secrets. The Army intelligence officers handle that. Her job is something stranger, and in many ways more important. She is trying to understand what the German soldier actually believes, what he tells his wife, what he tells his mother, what he writes when he thinks the letter will reach home, and no officer is standing over his shoulder. The letter in front of her right now is from a Gefreiter, a private first class stationed somewhere in Italy. She does not know his name. The return address has been torn off, either by accident or by the man himself. The letter is dated 6 weeks earlier. It is 3 pages long. The first 2 pages are about his daughter's birthday, about a pair of boots his wife should try to repair rather than replace, about his father's cough. The third page is different. The handwriting changes, smaller, tighter, the letters pressed harder into the paper, as though the man is trying to push the words through to the other side. She reads it twice. Then she sets it in a separate pile and reaches for her notepad. What she writes down in the next 4 minutes will eventually become part of a classified intelligence summary that reaches the desk of General George C. Marshall. And what that summary says, what tens of thousands of letters just like this one collectively say, will challenge almost everything the American military command believes about the state of German morale. To understand what Dorothy Hamill found in that pile of letters, and why the picture those letters painted was so different from the official version of events, we need to go back to the beginning, not to the war, to the system that was reading the mail. Part 1. The machinery of reading other people's letters. The United States Office of Censorship was established on the 19th of December, 1941, 12 days after Pearl Harbor, by executive order of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Its first director was Byron Price, a 50-year-old Associated Press executive from Topeka, Kansas, who had spent his career deciding what information was fit to print. Now he was deciding what information was fit to cross a border. The Office of Censorship's mandate covered American domestic mail, international telegrams, and, critically, captured enemy correspondence. That last category was the strange one. It had no clear precedent. The United States had intercepted enemy mail in the First World War, but in an ad hoc, disorganized fashion. Individual Army units grabbing letters off prisoners, translators working in the field, no central repository, no systematic analysis. By 1942, Price and his staff had decided that this time would be different. This time, the letters would be studied. The Postal Censorship Division, the branch that handled captured German mail specifically, was headquartered in Washington, but operated processing centers in New York, Miami, and San Francisco. By the end of 1943, the Washington Center alone employed over 300 translators and analysts, the majority of them women, many of them German Jewish émigrés who had fled Europe in the 1930s and now found themselves reading the private correspondence of the country that had expelled them. Pause and think about that for a moment. The most intimate, unguarded words of German soldiers, the letters they wrote to their wives and mothers and children, were being read translated and analyzed primarily by the people Germany had decided were not German enough to stay. The mechanics of the operation worked like this. German mail was captured in 3 ways: taken from prisoners of war at the point of capture, recovered from battlefield dead, and intercepted from ships and aircraft. The first category was by far the largest. When the United States Army processed a German prisoner, his personal effects were inventoried and his correspondence was separated out, both letters he was carrying to send and letters he had received. Everything went into a numbered envelope tagged to the prisoner's POW identification number and shipped back through the chain to the nearest processing center. From there, it went to Washington. In Washington, the letters were sorted by date, by front, by unit designation when legible, and by a rough category system that the division had developed by late 1942. The categories were military information, morale indicators, political attitudes, home front conditions, and a category added in early 1943 that nobody had anticipated needing, what the analysts called ideological drift. More on that later. The translators worked in pairs, one reading aloud, one transcribing and noting. The process was deliberately slow. The division's internal guidelines, written by a former professor of German literature named Dr. Heinrich Brenner, 53 years old, born in Munich, a refugee from the 1938 purge of Jewish academics, specified that translators should not simply translate. They should listen for what the letter was not saying. They should note the gaps. They should pay attention to the words a man chose when he had 100 words available and chose these particular ones. Brenner's guidelines ran to 47 pages. One passage, preserved in the National Archives, reads, "The German soldier has been trained since childhood to express loyalty in public and doubt in private. He has 2 vocabularies, the vocabulary of the regime, which he uses in official contexts, and the vocabulary of the heart, which he uses at home. Our task is to map the distance between these 2 vocabularies. That distance is the war's real morale report." Hold that thought. By mid-1943, the division had processed approximately 800,000 letters. By the end of the war, the number would exceed 3 million. The analysis reports generated from this material, classified at the highest level, distributed only to senior Army commanders and selected civilian officials, ran to hundreds of pages per quarter. They were called the German Soldier Letter Summaries, or GSLS reports. Most were declassified in the 1960s. Some were not fully released until the 1990s. A few pages of certain reports remain classified to this day for reasons that the National Archives describes only as ongoing relevance to intelligence methodology. What those reports said about German soldiers, what they actually wrote in their own words to the people they loved, is one of the most revealing and least read bodies of evidence from the entire war. Part 2. What the letters said before Stalingrad and what they said after. The division's analysts were quick to notice something in the early letters, the ones from 1941 and the first half of 1942. There was a quality to them that one analyst, a woman named Ruth Goldstein, described in an internal memo as the vocabulary of permission. The soldiers were not writing freely. They were writing as though someone were reading over their shoulder. Not the American censors. The soldiers didn't know about those. They were writing as though they expected their letters to be read by German military censors, by the Gestapo, by a nosy neighbor who might report to the block warden. And of course, many of them were right to worry. The German military postal service, the Feldpost, did censor outgoing mail, though inconsistently, and with far less thoroughness than the soldiers assumed. The fear of the censor was often more powerful than the censor itself. In the early letters, The ideological vocabulary of the Nazi state appears constantly and almost reflexively. Phrases like, "We are fighting for the fatherland," and "The Führer's vision will prevail," appear in letters that are otherwise entirely domestic. Letters about children's colds, about food shortages at home, about whether the neighbor's cow had calved yet. The political phrases are pasted in like wallpaper. They don't connect to anything. They just sit there, covering something. Here is the key detail. The analysts noticed that these phrases almost always appeared at the beginning or the end of a letter, never in the middle. The middle was where the real writing happened. The political vocabulary was a frame. What was inside the frame was something else entirely. Then came the winter of 1942 to 1943. Stalingrad. The Sixth Army, under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, was encircled at Stalingrad beginning on the 23rd of November 1942. 291,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped inside the pocket. The relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, under Erich von Manstein, failed to break through. By the 2nd of February 1943, the last remnants surrendered. Of the roughly 108,000 men taken prisoner, fewer than 6,000 would survive Soviet captivity to return to Germany. The rest died in camps, most within the first year. Before the pocket closed completely, the Luftwaffe flew supply missions in and mail missions out. In the weeks between the encirclement and the final collapse, an estimated 100,000 letters were flown out of the Stalingrad pocket. Many were captured when Luftwaffe transport aircraft were shot down or forced to land in Allied-controlled territory. Approximately 12,000 of those letters reached the Washington Processing Center. The division's analysts later described the experience of reading the Stalingrad letters as unlike anything they had processed before or after. Not because of the military information in them, there was very little, but because of what had happened to the language. The political vocabulary was gone. Not reduced, not diminished. Gone. In a sample of 400 Stalingrad letters analyzed in a special report dated April 1943, the analysts found that fewer than 3% contained any phrase that could be identified as regime-approved political language. 3%. In the letters from the same units just 6 months earlier, the figure had been over 60%. What replaced it? Read this carefully. The letters from inside the Stalingrad pocket were, according to the April 1943 report, characterized by 4 recurring themes. First, a preoccupation with the specific, the physical, the immediate, not the war, but the cold, not the battle, but hunger, not the ideology, but the body. Second, an almost complete absence of references to the Führer or the Nazi leadership. Third, a striking frequency of religious language, prayer, references to God, requests that the recipient pray for the writer, in letters from men who, in their earlier correspondence, had shown no religious sentiment whatsoever. And fourth, and this is the one that the analysts flagged most urgently, a new, quiet, persistent, undeniable theme of doubt. Not defeatism, not mutiny, doubt. A specific, careful, almost whispered doubt about whether any of it had been worth it, and whether the people at the top had told them the truth. One letter, quoted directly in the April 1943 report, was written by an Unteroffizier, a corporal, whose name was redacted in the declassified version. He was writing to his wife. The letter reads, in the division's translation, "I've been thinking about what we were told before this began. We were told it would be quick. We were told the Russians would not fight. I'm not angry. I am only trying to understand how it is possible to be so wrong about something so important." That's it. No treason, No ideology, no rage. Just a man trying to understand how it was possible to be so wrong about something so important. The analysts flagged it. Marshall read it. And the American High Command began to understand that they were looking at something they had not expected to find. Not a broken army, but a questioning one. Now meet Corporal Ernst Breitmann, 24 years old, from Freiburg im Breisgau in southwestern Germany, near the Swiss border. Before the war, he was an apprentice watchmaker, the kind of meticulous work that requires patience and the ability to hold very small things still while you figure out what's wrong with them. He was captured near Anzio, Italy, in March of 1944 with 31 letters in his pack. 11 he had received from his mother, 8 from his fiancée, and 12 that he had written and never sent. The unsent letters are what the division's analysts considered the most important find of the Italian campaign's first 6 months. The unsent letters had no censor in mind. Not the German military censor, not the imagined Gestapo reader, not even the recipient herself, because they were never going to be sent. Breitmann had written them for himself. Or perhaps, as one analyst suggested in a note attached to the file, he had written them because the alternative was silence, and silence, in that particular situation, was unbearable. The 12 unsent letters span a period from June 1943 to February 1944. They document, in the precise, patient handwriting of a man trained to work with tiny components, the gradual disintegration of something the analysts struggled to name. It was not morale, exactly. It was not loyalty, exactly. It was something more fundamental. The assumption that the people in charge knew what they were doing. In the first letter, dated June of 1943, Breitmann writes about the Allied landing in Sicily. He is not panicked. He is analytical. He writes, and this is the division's translation, "They have landed in Sicily. This means the war in Africa is over, and they are coming north. I do not know why this surprises me. It should not surprise me. But I find that I expected something different to happen by now." By December of 1943, the language has changed. He is no longer analytical. He is tired. He writes, "I've been in this army for 3 years. I have not seen my mother in 14 months. I have not seen Elsa in 16 months. I'm 23 years old, and I'm very tired, and I do not understand what we are still doing here." The final unsent letter, dated February of 1944, 3 weeks before his capture, is the shortest. It is 11 lines. He writes about the cold. He writes about a friend who died the previous week. No name, just, "My friend from the 2nd Squad." And then, at the end, he writes something that the division's senior analyst underlined twice in red pencil. "I keep asking myself what I believed in when this started. I cannot remember. I think I believed in something, but I cannot remember what it was." Stop and sit with that for a moment. A 23-year-old watchmaker from Freiburg, writing to no one, trying to remember what he believed in when the war started. Unable to remember. The division's analysts called this pattern ideological amnesia. It appeared in letters from every front, every rank, every region of Germany. It was not political opposition. It was not resistance. It was something quieter and, in many ways, more devastating to the German war effort. A generation of men who had been handed a set of beliefs at the beginning of the war and were now, in the privacy of their unsent letters and their most guarded correspondence, discovering that those beliefs had quietly dissolved without their noticing. Part 3. The things they could not say out loud. Here is what the division's analysts expected to find in German soldier mail based on the standard model of wartime morale analysis. Complaints about food, complaints about leadership, homesickness, occasional expressions of fear, frequent expressions of hope for quick victory or quick end. This was what British mail censors had found in German prisoner mail in the First World War. This was the baseline. What they found instead was a taxonomy of silence. The German soldiers, the analysts discovered, had developed an extraordinarily sophisticated system for communicating things that could not be communicated directly. Some of this was explicit code, prearranged signals between a soldier and his family. One letter, captured in Tunisia in 1943, contained a passage about a garden that, when cross-referenced with earlier letters from the same prisoner, clearly described unit positions, using flower names as stand-ins for place names. That kind of code was straightforward to identify and was handled by the military intelligence branch. But the more interesting kind of silence was not code. It was omission. The analysts noticed that German soldiers almost never wrote directly about fear. Fear, in the letters, is a ghost. You know it's there because of what surrounds the space where it should be. A man writes 3 paragraphs about his daughter's drawings and then says, with no transition, "I hope to see you again." He does not say he is afraid he won't, he just says he hopes to. The fear lives in the gap between "I hope" and everything that hope implies when a man is writing it from a front that is collapsing. One analyst, a woman named Lieselotte Faber, 31 years old, born in Hamburg, a former secondary school teacher who had fled Germany in 1938, wrote a 7-page internal memo in August of 1943 that the division's director later called the most important analytical document his office produced during the entire war. Faber's memo was titled, "The Grammar of the Unsaid." Its central argument was this: German soldiers had been conditioned from childhood by the Nazi educational system to express everything in the language of collective purpose. We, the fatherland, the struggle, the future. The self, I, my fear, my doubt, what I want, had been systematically devalued as selfish and weak. The result was a generation of men who were experiencing profound individual crisis, but had been given no language to express it in the first person. So they expressed it in the third person. They expressed it through objects. They expressed it through time. Here is what Faber meant by "through time." She noticed that German soldiers, in letters from late 1943 onward, almost never wrote about the future in concrete terms. Earlier letters, from 1941, from the victories in France and the early advances in Russia, were full of future plans. After the war, we will do this. After the war, we will go there. When I come home, we will. The future was a place they were going. By late 1943, the future had disappeared from the letters almost entirely. In its place was an obsessive focus on the past. Men wrote about their childhoods. They wrote about specific meals they remembered eating 10 years ago. They wrote about the smell of their hometown in summer. They wrote about the exact texture of a chair they used to sit in. They were building, in their letters, a kind of interior museum, a private archive of the life that existed before all of this, as though they were not sure the future was a place they would reach, and so they were trying to hold on to the past as hard as they could. Faber wrote, "The German soldier has stopped planning. He is remembering. This is not the psychology of a man who expects to win. It is the psychology of a man who is trying to make sure that if he does not survive, something of what he was will have been written down." Now here is what none of this showed up as in official German military morale reports. The Wehrmacht had its own morale monitoring system. The IC officers, the divisional intelligence officers, responsible for tracking the mental state of their units. They submitted regular reports to Army Group headquarters. Those reports, many of which were also captured and analyzed by the Americans, painted a picture that was almost the inverse of what the private letters showed. The official reports described units as steady, determined, committed to the struggle. They described morale as satisfactory, in situations where the private correspondence of the men in those same units described something close to despair. The gap between the official reports and the private letters was not, the analysts concluded, primarily the result of lying officers. It was the result of a system that had made certain truths unspeakable. The IC officers were not, for the most part, deliberately falsifying their reports. They were reporting what they could see, which was men doing their jobs, following orders, maintaining discipline. They could not see what was in the letters. They could not see the interior museum of remembered childhoods and specific chairs and the smell of a hometown in summer. They could not see that the men who were following orders and maintaining discipline had somewhere inside them stopped believing in what they were doing. The American analysts could see it because they were reading the mail. If this investigation is giving you a picture of the war that doesn't appear in the official histories, not the version that survived in the Army's after-action reports, but the version that men wrote down when they thought they were writing to someone who loved them, press like. It helps keep this kind of history visible a little longer. And it matters. Part 4. The verdict and what it cost to know it. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The German soldier letter summaries, across 3 million letters processed between 1942 and 1945, document one of the most precisely recorded psychological transformations in military history: the collapse of ideological conviction in the German enlisted soldier, happening in real time, in handwriting, in the private language of men writing to their families. It did not happen all at once, it did not happen uniformly, and it is critical to understand that it did not translate, in most cases, into reduced military effectiveness, at least not in the short term. The German soldier of 1944 was still, by every measurable standard of combat performance, among the most effective soldiers in the world. He still fought. He still held positions. He still counterattacked. The letters show why this is not a contradiction. What the letters show is that the German soldier, by the middle years of the war, had largely decoupled his fighting from his believing. He was not fighting for the Führer. He was not fighting for National Socialism. He was fighting for the man next to him, for the unit, for the specific and immediate obligation of not letting down the people who were depending on him right now. This is not a new observation. Military historians have noted it for decades. What the letters add is the texture of it, the granular, private, handwritten texture of men in the process of making that decoupling happen inside themselves. Here is a specific example from the GSLS report of the third quarter of 1944, the period immediately following the Allied breakout from Normandy. An Oberfeldwebel, a master sergeant, captured in France in August of that year, was found carrying a letter he had written to his brother but had not yet posted. The letter was dated 2 days before his capture. In it, he writes, and this is the division's translation, preserved in full in the declassified archive. I want to tell you something that I have not been able to say to anyone here. I do not believe we are going to win this war. I have not believed it for a long time. I do not say this to be a coward or a defeatist. I say it because I think it is the truth. And I am so tired of not saying the truth that I'm writing it down, even though I will probably not send this. We are going to lose. And I am going to keep fighting anyway. Not because I believe in the cause, because these are my men, and I cannot leave them. Read that again. I do not believe we are going to win this war. I am going to keep fighting anyway. This is the sentence that the American military command found most difficult to process when they read it in the GSLS summaries. They had assumed, based on their own experience, based on the First World War model, based on simple logic, that when soldiers stopped believing in victory, they stopped fighting effectively. The letters showed that this was wrong, or rather, They showed that the relationship between belief and combat effectiveness was far more complicated than anyone had assumed. The Master Sergeant's letter was flagged by Dorothy Hamill, the same analyst we met at the beginning of this investigation, now senior enough to be doing primary analysis rather than transcription. She wrote in her notes, "This man is not a fanatic and not a coward. He is something harder to deal with, a professional. He has separated the question of whether this is right from the question of what he owes the people next to him. The war will not end because he stops believing. It will end when there are no more people next to him to feel he owes something to." She was right, and the date of her note, August of 1944, was exactly the moment when that process was beginning to accelerate. The letters from the final year of the war, from September of 1944 through May of 1945, are the most painful to read. Not because they are more dramatic, because they are less dramatic. The earlier letters, even the despairing ones, have a quality of searching in them. Men trying to understand, trying to make sense of what is happening. The late letters have largely given up on understanding. They have contracted to the immediate, the specific, the next meal, the next letter from home, whether the children are well, whether the house is still standing. The world has shrunk to the size of a man's immediate circle, and within that circle, every detail is precious and fragile. One letter, from a Gefreiter captured in the Rhineland in March of 1945, consists entirely of a list. No salutation, no narrative, no political language. Just a list, written to his wife, of things he wants her to remember about their apartment in Dusseldorf. The way the light comes through the kitchen window in the morning, the sound the third stair makes, the smell of the linden tree in the courtyard in June. 12 items on the list. The letter ends with, "I am writing these down so that if I forget, you can remind me." He was 22 years old. The division's analysts noted that letters like this, the list letters, the inventory letters, the letters that were essentially private acts of documentation rather than communication, increased dramatically in frequency from the autumn of 1944 onward. Faber, who by this point had been promoted to lead the division's analytical section, wrote in her quarterly report of January 1945, "The German soldier is no longer writing letters, he is writing wills. Not legal documents, nothing about property or money, wills of memory. He is trying to ensure that the specific texture of his life before all this is recorded somewhere." The political war ended for most of these men somewhere in 1943. What they are fighting now is a private war against oblivion. A private war against oblivion. Count what that phrase means. These were not broken men. They were not cowards. They were men who had been handed a set of beliefs and a set of enemies and sent to fight a war that was, by any rational analysis, already lost, and who were, in the only private space available to them, doing something that no regime can train out of a human being, trying to make sure they were remembered as real people, with real lives, and not just as soldiers. Now consider the institutional response to all of this intelligence. The GSLS reports went to Marshall. They went to Eisenhower's headquarters. They went to the senior planning staff for the Normandy invasion, where they directly influenced the decision to prioritize the rapid advance over prisoner of war management. Because the reports showed that German soldiers who were cut off from their immediate unit were far more likely to surrender than those who remained in cohesive groups. The "do not leave them" psychology that the letters so clearly documented was, in operational terms, a vulnerability. Destroy the unit, and the individual soldier loses the only reason he is still fighting. This insight, derived directly from reading Captured Mail, shaped American tactical doctrine in the final year of the war. The emphasis on encirclement, on cutting units off from each other, on disrupting the lateral communication between German formations, was not only militarily logical,
It was psychologically precise. It was aimed at the specific thing the letters said the German soldier was still fighting for.
Whether the men who made these decisions acknowledged the source of their insight, whether they sat in their planning rooms and said, "We know this because of the letters," is not recorded. What is recorded is that the tactics worked. Now the biographies. Dorothy Hamill was discharged from government service in September of 1945. She returned to Dayton, Ohio, and went back to teaching, elementary school, not university. She taught for 31 years. She died in 1993 at the age of 75. Her personal papers, donated to the University of Dayton in 1996, include a small notebook she kept during her time at the division. The notebook contains, in her handwriting, fragments of letters she found particularly significant. Not the military intelligence ones, but the personal ones. The list letters, the memory wills. She kept them for 50 years. Lieselotte Faber returned to Germany in 1947. She taught at the University of Hamburg for 20 years, specializing in the literature of the Second World War. She died in 1989, 1 month before the Berlin Wall fell. She never published her Grammar of the Unsaid memo. A colleague submitted it to a German academic journal posthumously. It was rejected twice and accepted on the third submission. It is now considered a foundational document in the field of wartime epistolary analysis. Ernst Breitmann, the watchmaker from Freiburg, the man with the 12 unsent letters, survived the war. He was released from a prisoner of war camp in Georgia in October of 1945. He returned to Freiburg and resumed his watchmaking apprenticeship, completing it in 1947. He married his fiancée Elsa in 1948. He died in 2003 at the age of 83. Whether he ever knew that his unsent letters had been read, translated, analyzed, and used to help shape American military strategy is not known. The letters themselves are preserved in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, in Box 47 of Record Group 216. The Oberfeldwebel who wrote, "I am going to keep fighting anyway," his name, too, was redacted in the declassified version of the GSLS report. He survived his capture. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946. Beyond that, the record is silent. Byron Price, the director of the Office of Censorship, received the Medal of Merit in 1946 for his work. His citation mentioned the interception of military intelligence. It did not mention the letters. Here is what this investigation means. The German soldier letter summaries are, among other things, a record of what happens when a state asks its citizens to stop being individuals and start being instruments. The Nazi project, total mobilization, total ideology, the subordination of the self to the collective, produced, in its soldiers, something the regime did not intend and could not have anticipated. Men who were extraordinarily effective at fighting and at the same time entirely hollow at the ideological core. The fighting and the believing had separated. The believing had gone first. The fighting continued on the fuel of obligation. Obligation to the man next to you, obligation to the people at home, obligation to the specific and immediate rather than the abstract and ideological. The letters show this happening in real time. They show the exact moment, different for each man, but for most of them somewhere in the winter of 1942 to 1943, when the political vocabulary dropped out of the letters and was replaced by something older and smaller and more human. The smell of a hometown in summer, the sound a stair makes, the way light comes through a kitchen window. There is a German word, Heimweh, that is usually translated as homesickness, but it is more specific than that. It means literally home pain. Not the desire to be somewhere else, the pain of not being where you belong. The letters are full of Heimweh. Not as a complaint, not as a weakness, the men almost never use the word itself, but as a presence. The thing that is there in every letter, underneath the political vocabulary when it existed, and in plain sight when it didn't. What Dorothy Hamill found in that basement room in Washington, in the pile of letters from a soldier whose name had been torn off, was not military intelligence. It was the record of a generation's private reckoning with a catastrophe they had been told was a triumph. The man on the third page, with his small, tight handwriting, pressing the words through to the other side, he was not writing to her. He was writing to his wife. He was trying to say something true in a world that had been organized to prevent him from saying true things. She read it twice. She said it in the separate pile. She reached for her notepad, and she wrote it down. Because that was her job, and she understood that her job was not to find secrets. It was to find people. If this investigation gave you something, press like. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the most important intelligence the United States military gathered in the Second World War was not decoded from signals. It was read from letters, written by hand, in the grammar of the unsaid. The man with the torn-off return address, the watchmaker trying to remember what he believed in, the master sergeant who had already lost the war and was going to keep fighting anyway. They were all, in the end, trying to be remembered as something more than soldiers. They were.